The millionaire's daughter was dying in the emergency room, and the only person who could save her was the same nurse he had humiliated just hours before. Dr. Richard Blackwell stood frozen in the doorway, watching as 34-year-old Sarah Martinez worked with steady hands over his 7-year-old daughter Emma, her fingers moving with the precision that defied everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd called just a simple cleaning lady pretending to be a nurse in front of half the hospital staff that very morning. Sarah's brown eyes remained focused on the child's pale face as she adjusted the oxygen mask. Her weathered hands that Richard had mocked for their calluses and lack of manicured nails, now the only thing standing between his daughter and tragedy. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman he'd dismissed as beneath his notice was now the most important person in his world. But this moment of crisis was just the culmination of months of cruelty that had defined their relationship at Mercy General Hospital in downtown Chicago. Sarah Martinez had been working double shifts for 3 years, sending money home to her elderly mother in a small Texas border town while putting herself through nursing school at night. Her scrubs were always clean but never new, her shoes comfortable but worn, her lunch always a simple sandwich wrapped in paper rather than the gourmet salads the other staff ordered for La Hospital's upscale cafeteria. The morning everything changed had started like any other. Sarah arrived at 5:30 a.m. for her shift, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her tired eyes still kind despite the exhaustion that came from working 16-hour days. She'd been assigned to the children's ward again, where her gentle manner and infinite patience had made her beloved by both young patients and their worried parents. Children who screamed when other nurses approached would calm instantly when Sarah entered their rooms, her soft voice and warm smile creating an island of peace in the chaos of pediatric medicine. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible stories of human transformation and unexpected love. Dr. Richard Blackwell had inherited Mercy General from his father 2 years earlier, along with a fortune that made him one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors. At 38, he was handsome in the way that money polished, perfectly styled dark hair, expensive suits that fit like they were painted on, and the kind of confident smile that came from never having been told no. He drove a black Maserati, lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, and had never worked a day in his life for anything he couldn't simply buy. The other doctors and administrators at Mercy General treated him with the deference that wealth commanded. But Richard's particular cruelty seemed reserved for the nursing staff, especially those like Sarah, who clearly came from humble backgrounds. He would make cutting remarks about their education, their appearance, their accents, always delivered with a smile that made it impossible for them to complain without seeming oversensitive. Sarah had endured months of his casual dismissals. When she'd suggested a new protocol for managing pain in pediatric patients, he'd laughed and said, "I think we'll stick to medical advice from actual medical professionals, thank you." When she'd worn her grandmother's small gold cross to work, he'd commented loudly that some people need to remember that this is a hospital, not a revival meeting. Each slight was small enough to seem insignificant, but together they had created an atmosphere where other staff members felt permission to treat Sarah as lesser than, despite her obvious competence and the genuine love patients and their families showed her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah had just finished helping Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose grandson was recovering from surgery, when she overheard the woman talking to another visitor about how wonderful Sarah had been, how she'd stayed past her shift the night before to sit with the frightened child, how she'd brought him homemade cookies from her own kitchen.
Sarah's cheeks had flushed with pride. Recognition of her hard work was rare in the hospital's hierarchy.
She was walking past the main nursing station when she heard Dr. Blackwell's voice, elevated just enough to ensure everyone nearby could hear. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" he was saying to Dr. Jennifer Morrison, the chief of pediatrics, "how some people mistake basic human decency for professional competence. That Martinez woman has half the families thinking she's Mother Teresa, but at the end of the day, she's just a cleaning lady who managed to pass a nursing exam." Dr. Morrison, a woman who had worked her way up through years of grueling residency and fellowship, shifted uncomfortably. "Richard, Sarah is actually one of our most capable nurses. Her patient satisfaction scores are—" "Please," Richard interrupted, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that money bought. "Patient satisfaction. These people would be satisfied with anyone who speaks to them nicely and brings them free cookies. That doesn't make someone a real medical professional." He gestured toward Sarah, who had stopped in her tracks, her face burning with humiliation as she realized the entire nursing station was listening. "Look at her. Does she look like someone you'd trust with your child's life? Those bargain store scrubs, that tired face, those hands that look like they belong in a kitchen, not an operating room." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her, some with pity, others with the uncomfortable fascination that people have for public humiliation. Her hands, the hands that had comforted hundreds of sick children, that had learned every medical procedure through nights of studying after exhausting shifts, trembled slightly as she clutched her clipboard. She started to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, but Richard wasn't finished. "The truth is," he continued, warming to his theme, "some people are born to serve, and others are born to lead. It's not personal, it's just reality. Sarah here does her job adequately, I suppose, but let's not pretend she belongs in the same conversation as real medical professionals. She's sweet, I'll give her that, but sweetness doesn't save lives. Competence does, education does, background does. What would you do if someone humiliated you like this in front of your colleagues? Leave a comment below and let us know." Sarah's dark eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Her grandfather had worked in the fields of South Texas his entire life. Her mother had cleaned houses to put food on the table. And Sarah herself had worked 3 jobs while putting herself through nursing school, graduating with honors despite having none of the advantages that someone like Richard Blackwell had been born with. She had earned every certification, passed every exam, and proven herself capable time and time again. But in that moment, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the nursing station, with dozens of pairs of eyes watching her humiliation, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. "Excuse me," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. She turned and walked toward the elevator with as much dignity as she could muster, her head held high even as she heard the uncomfortable murmur of conversation resume behind her. What Sarah didn't know was that 7-year-old Emma Blackwell had been sitting in the children's playroom just around the corner, coloring quietly while she waited for her father to finish his rounds. Emma had been coming to the hospital more frequently lately, not because she was sick, but because her father, consumed with work and social obligations, often had nowhere else to bring her. The staff had grown used to seeing the little girl with golden curls and sad green eyes, always impeccably dressed but often alone, wandering the halls while her father attended to business. Emma had heard every word of her father's cruel speech, and her young heart had broken for the kind nurse who had always smiled at her in the hallways, who had once helped her find a coloring book when she was bored, who remembered her name and always asked how she was doing.
Even at 7, Emma understood cruelty when she heard it, and she knew her father had been terribly, terribly wrong. The afternoon passed in a haze of awkward glances and whispered conversations. Sarah threw herself into her work with even more determination than usual, checking on her young patients with extra care, bringing comfort to worried parents, and maintaining the professional demeanor that had made her so respected among the families she served, even if her colleagues couldn't see her worth.
Around 4 o'clock, as Sarah was updating charts in the pediatric ward, she heard a commotion from the emergency department downstairs. Ambulance sirens wailed outside, and the hospital's trauma alert system announced an incoming pediatric emergency. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She had spent months working in the ER before being transferred to the children's ward, and she knew that all available staff would be needed. She made her way downstairs quickly, arriving just as the ambulance doors flew open. The paramedics were shouting medical information as they rushed a small form on a stretcher through the automatic doors. But Sarah's blood turned to ice as she caught sight of golden curls spilled across the white pillow. 7-year-old female found unconscious in the school playground, the lead paramedic was saying. Possible head injury, vitals are dropping, we need Trauma Bay 2 immediately. It was Emma Blackwell. Sarah watched in horror as the medical team surrounded the stretcher, Dr. Morrison taking charge of the situation with practiced efficiency. Richard Blackwell appeared as if from nowhere, his face white with terror as he saw his daughter's still form. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the arrogant millionaire looked entirely human, entirely helpless. "Emma, baby, Daddy's here," he whispered, his voice cracking as he tried to follow the stretcher into the trauma bay. Dr. Morrison gently but firmly blocked his path. "Richard, you know the rules. You can't be in there while we work. Let us do our jobs." "But she's my daughter," he said, the words coming out as a desperate plea rather than the demand they would normally be. "She's all I have." Sarah had never known that Richard was a single father, had never heard him mention Emma's mother, had never seen the vulnerability that was now written across his face like a roadmap of love and fear. In that moment, he wasn't the cruel hospital owner who had humiliated her hours before. He was just a terrified father watching his world fall apart. The trauma bay erupted in controlled chaos as the medical team worked to stabilize Emma. Sarah remained in the hallway, wanting to help but knowing she wasn't part of the emergency team. She watched through the glass doors as machines beeped urgently and medical staff moved with the choreographed precision that came from years of training. Then, everything went wrong at once. Emma's heart monitor began showing an irregular rhythm, and her blood pressure dropped dangerously low. Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the air with sharp authority. "She's going into shock. We need to get her stabilized now, or we're going to lose her." "The pediatric cardiologist is in surgery," someone called out. "Dr. Peterson is stuck in traffic, and Dr. Williams is at Northwestern with a conference. ETA 20 minutes minimum." "We don't have 20 minutes," Dr. Morrison replied grimly. "Her heart rhythm is getting worse." It was then that Sarah stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. "I can help." The room fell silent except for the urgent beeping of Emma's monitors. Dr. Morrison looked at Sarah with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Sarah, you're not certified for pediatric cardiac procedures." "Actually, I am," Sarah said, moving toward the trauma bay with steady purpose. "I completed my pediatric cardiac certification 6 months ago at Northwestern. I've been working on my advanced practice degree at night, and I finished my clinical rotations in pediatric cardiology last semester." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the room. Richard Blackwell, who had been standing helplessly in the doorway, turned to stare at Sarah with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You... what?" he stammered.
But Sarah was already at Emma's bedside, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had trained for exactly this moment. She quickly assessed the child's condition, her dark eyes focused and determined. "She's got supraventricular tachycardia triggered by the head trauma," she said, her voice calm and professional. "If we can get her heart rhythm stabilized, her blood pressure should normalize. Dr. Morrison, I need you to prep for synchronized cardioversion while I try vagal maneuvers first." "Sarah, are you sure about this?" Dr. Morrison asked, but she was already moving to follow Sarah's instructions. "I'm sure," Sarah replied, her hands gentle but precise as she began the procedure. "Emma, sweetheart, if you can hear me, you're going to be okay. I'm going to help your heart feel better." What happened next would be talked about at Mercy General for years to come. With steady hands and quiet confidence, Sarah worked to stabilize Emma's dangerous heart rhythm, using a combination of medical techniques and the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of working with children. She spoke to Emma in soothing tones throughout the procedure, as if the unconscious child could hear every word. "That's it, Emma. You're being so brave, just like always. Your daddy's right here, and he loves you so much. We're all going to take good care of you." Slowly, miraculously, Emma's heart rhythm began to stabilize. The dangerous, irregular beats smoothed into a steady, strong pattern, and her blood pressure began to climb back to normal levels. The room seemed to exhale collectively as the immediate crisis passed. Dr. Morrison looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah's tired face showed the first small smile she'd managed all day. "Northwestern has an excellent pediatric cardiac program. I've been taking classes there for 2 years, working toward my nurse practitioner degree. I graduate next month." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady, reassuring beep of Emma's heart monitor. Richard Blackwell stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through a dozen different emotions as he processed what he had just witnessed. The woman he had dismissed as a simple, uneducated nurse had just saved his daughter's life with skills and knowledge that he hadn't even known she possessed. "She's stable now," Sarah said quietly, checking Emma's vital signs one more time. "The head CT should tell us more about the injury, but her cardiac response is good. She should make a full recovery." Richard stepped into the room on unsteady legs, his eyes fixed on his daughter's peaceful face. Emma's color was returning to normal, and her breathing was deep and regular. He reached out with a shaking hand to touch her golden curls, then looked up at Sarah with an expression of pure gratitude and shame. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. She's everything to me." Sarah's response was characteristically gentle. "No thanks necessary. This is what we do." But Richard shook his head, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "No, it's not. What you did, the skill, the knowledge, the compassion, I had no idea who you really were." The weight of his morning's cruelty hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah looked at him steadily, her dark eyes neither accusing nor forgiving, simply observant. "With respect, Dr. Blackwell, you never asked." The words were spoken without malice, but they hit Richard like a physical blow. He thought about all the assumptions he had made, all the cruel words he had spoken, all the times he had dismissed Sarah's intelligence and dedication based on nothing more than her humble background and worn scrubs. I was wrong," he said, the admission seeming to cost him enormous effort. "About everything. About you." Sarah nodded once, then turned her attention back to Emma. "Right now, let's focus on Emma. She needs to wake up soon, and when she does, she'll want to see her father." As if summoned by Sarah's words, Emma's eyelashes began to flutter. Her green eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then seeking and finding her father's face. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and confused. "I'm here, baby," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." Emma's gaze moved around the room until it found Sarah, and a small smile appeared on her pale lips. "Hi, Miss Sarah. Are you taking care of me?" Sarah's own eyes filled with tears at the child's innocent question. "Hi, sweetheart. Yes, we're all taking care of you. You're going to be just fine." "I heard what you said to Miss Sarah this morning," Emma said suddenly, her young voice carrying a weight that made every adult in the room freeze. "It made me sad, Daddy. Miss Sarah is nice. She always smiles at me." Richard's face crumpled with shame and regret. He looked from his daughter to Sarah, understanding fully for the first time the magnitude of his cruelty and the grace with which it had been received. If you're enjoying this incredible story of transformation and unexpected love, please give this video a like and let us know in the comments what you think of Richard's journey. Over the next few days, as Emma recovered from her concussion and the hospital buzz with the story of Sarah's remarkable intervention, Richard found himself seeing Mercy General through entirely different eyes. He noticed how patients' faces lit up when Sarah entered their rooms, how parents sought her out for comfort and advice, how even the most difficult children became calm and cooperative under her care. He also began to learn about Sarah's real story, piece by piece, as if solving a puzzle he had never bothered to examine before. He discovered that she sent half of her paycheck to support her mother and younger brother in Texas. He learned that she had graduated at the top of her nursing class despite working full-time to pay for school. He found out that she volunteered at a free clinic on weekends and had been accepted to Northwestern's competitive nurse practitioner program, where she had been studying advanced pediatric care while working exhausting shifts at Mercy General. The more he learned, the smaller and more ashamed he felt. Sarah Martinez wasn't just a good nurse. She was extraordinary, both professionally and personally, in ways that his privileged background had never allowed him to recognize or appreciate. One evening, a week after Emma's accident, Richard found Sarah in the children's ward, reading quietly to a young patient whose parents couldn't visit that night. She was sitting in a rocking chair beside the boy's bed, her voice soft and soothing as she read from a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. The child's eyes were heavy with sleep, comforted by her presence. Richard waited in the doorway until she had finished the story and tucked the little boy in for the night. When she saw him standing there, she showed no surprise, simply nodded politely as she had always done. "Dr. Blackwell, how can I help you?" "I wanted to talk to you," he said quietly, mindful of the sleeping children nearby. "About what I said last week. About everything." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then gestured toward the small break room at the end of the hall. They walked there in silence, and Richard closed the door behind them. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words that could possibly express the depth of his regret. "What I said about you, the way I treated you, there's no excuse for it. None at all." Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot that the night shift kept brewing and offered him one. He shook his head, too nervous to drink anything. "You're right," she said simply. "There isn't an excuse." Her directness surprised him. He had expected anger or perhaps cold professionalism, but her matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his wrongdoing somehow made him feel worse than either would have. "I want to make it right," he said desperately. "I want to, I don't know, apologize publicly, give you a promotion, pay for your school expenses, something, anything." Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Why? Because, because I was wrong. Because you saved Emma's life. Because you're an incredible nurse, and I treated you terribly. All of those things were true last week, too, Sarah pointed out quietly. Before Emma's accident, I was still the same person, with the same education, the same skills, the same heart. What changed wasn't me, Dr. Blackwell. What changed was your perception of me. Richard felt heat rise in his cheeks. She was absolutely right, and her gentle way of pointing it out somehow made it even more devastating than if she had screamed at him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I judged you based on superficial things, your clothes, your background, assumptions I made without knowing anything about who you really were. I was arrogant and cruel, and I'm ashamed of myself." Sarah nodded, accepting his words without immediately responding. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "My grandmother used to tell me that people show you who they really are when they think it doesn't matter. When they think you can't hurt them or help them or affect their lives in any meaningful way. That's when you see their true character." The words hit Richard like a slap. "And I showed you that I'm exactly the kind of person I accused you of not being. Someone whose background and education didn't make them a better human being." "You showed me that you're human," Sarah corrected gently. "Flawed, capable of cruelty, but also capable of growth. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Richard looked at her across the small break room table. This woman who had every right to hate him, but instead was offering him the kind of grace he had never shown her. Emma had been right to defend her, and he had been blind to everything that made Sarah extraordinary. "I want to do better," he said finally. "I want to be better, not just because of what you did for Emma, but because you've made me see how wrong I've been about so many things." Sarah nodded, accepting his words without immediately responding. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "My grandmother used to tell me that people show you who they really are when they think it doesn't matter. When they think you can't hurt them or help them or affect their lives in any meaningful way. That's when you see their true character." The words hit Richard like a slap. "And I showed you that I'm exactly the kind of person I accused you of not being. Someone whose background and education didn't make them a better human being." "You showed me that you're human," Sarah corrected gently. "Flawed, capable of cruelty, but also capable of growth. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Richard looked at her across the small break room table. This woman who had every right to hate him, but instead was offering him the kind of grace he had never shown her. Emma had been right to defend her, and he had been blind to everything that made Sarah extraordinary. "I want to do better," he said finally. "I want to be better, not just because of what you did for Emma, but because you've made me see how wrong I've been about so many things." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That's a good start."
Over the following weeks, Richard began to make changes at Mercy General that went far beyond personal apologies. He instituted new policies recognizing the contributions of nursing staff, created educational opportunities for employees who wanted to advance their careers, and began spending time actually talking to the people who made the hospital run, rather than simply issuing orders from his executive office. But more than that, he found himself drawn to Sarah's quiet strength and endless compassion. He began stopping by the children's ward, not to check on hospital operations, but simply to watch her work. He saw how she remembered every patient's name, how she celebrated small victories with families, how she stayed late to comfort worried parents, how she somehow made the sterile hospital environment feel warm and welcoming. Sarah, for her part, remained politely professional, but began to show glimpses of the woman beneath the careful exterior she maintained at work. Richard learned that she loved old movies and read voraciously despite her exhausting schedule.
He discovered that she had a quick sense of humor and a sharp intelligence that expressed itself in unexpected moments of insight and wisdom. One December evening, as Chicago's first snow fell outside the hospital windows, Richard found Sarah in the children's playroom, helping Emma with a puzzle while she waited for him to finish his rounds. Emma had been coming to the hospital more often since her accident, not because she was sick, but because she had formed a deep attachment to Sarah and begged to visit her. "Miss Sarah, tell Daddy about the butterflies," Emma was saying as Richard approached. Sarah looked up with a smile that made Richard's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. "Oh, Emma, your father's probably too busy to hear about butterflies." "No," Richard said quickly, settling into a chair beside them. "I'd love to hear about butterflies." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but Emma was already launching into an animated explanation of how Sarah had been teaching her about the monarch butterfly migration and how the butterflies traveled thousands of miles to places they had never been before, guided by instincts passed down through generations.
Miss Sarah says that sometimes the most amazing journeys happen when we trust something bigger than ourselves, Emma said seriously, and that even little creatures can do impossible things if they're brave enough. Richard looked at Sarah, understanding that she was talking about more than butterflies. That sounds like very wise advice. Miss Sarah is the smartest person I know, Emma declared with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Smarter than all the doctors, and prettier too. Emma, Sarah laughed, but Richard found himself nodding in agreement. "She's absolutely right," he said, his voice carrying more weight than the casual comment warranted, on both counts. Their eyes met across the puzzle table, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with medicine or hospitals or the complicated history of their relationship. It was the recognition of two people who had found something unexpected and precious in the last place they would have thought to look. What do you think about this beautiful transformation? Have you ever completely misjudged someone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The relationship that developed between Richard and Sarah over the winter months was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Richard, who had always dated women from his own social circle, sophisticated, polished women who understood the world of country clubs and charity galas, found himself completely enchanted by Sarah's authenticity and depth. Sarah, who had been hurt so deeply by his initial cruelty, slowly began to trust the man he was becoming rather than the man he had been. Their courtship was unconventional, conducted in hospital hallways and children's playrooms, over coffee in the cafeteria, and during quiet moments in the pediatric ward. Richard learned to see the hospital through Sarah's eyes, understanding for the first time the deep satisfaction that came from genuinely helping people rather than simply managing an institution. Sarah began to see past Richard's privileged exterior to the man underneath, someone who was capable of profound change and genuine love when he allowed himself to be vulnerable. Emma, meanwhile, became their unwitting matchmaker, insisting that Sarah join them for dinners and weekend activities, creating a family dynamic that neither Richard nor Sarah had planned, but both found themselves treasuring. The little girl who had once been lonely in her father's cold, perfect world now had the warmth and attention she had always craved, while also serving as the bridge between two adults who were learning to love each other despite the seemingly insurmountable differences in their backgrounds. The hospital staff watched this unlikely romance develop with fascination and, in many cases, approval. The changes in Richard were impossible to ignore. He was kinder, more thoughtful, genuinely interested in the welfare of his employees rather than just the hospital's profit margins.
Sarah's influence was making him a better leader and, more importantly, a better man. But not everyone was pleased with the developing relationship. Some of Richard's wealthy friends and business associates made it clear that they disapproved of his "the help," as they not so diplomatically put it. Some of the hospital's board members expressed concern about the appropriateness of the owner dating an employee. And even some of Sarah's colleagues questioned whether she could trust the man who had humiliated her so publicly just months before. The pressure came to a head on Valentine's Day, when Richard made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of planning an elaborate, expensive gesture that would have been his typical approach to romance, he did something much simpler and infinitely more meaningful. He arranged for Sarah to have the evening off, then showed up at her small apartment in his Maserati, dressed not in one of his expensive suits, but in jeans and a sweater, carrying a single red rose and a handwritten letter. Sarah opened the door in her favorite worn jeans and a soft blue sweater that brought out her eyes, and Richard thought he had never seen any woman look more beautiful. She invited him in to her modest but warm living space, which was filled with books, family photos, and the kind of personal touches that made a house a home. "I have something for you," he said, holding out the rose and the letter with hands that trembled slightly with nervousness. Sarah accepted both gifts with surprise and curiosity. "Richard, you didn't need to." "Read it," he said, quietly. "Please." Sarah unfolded the letter, written in Richard's careful handwriting on simple white paper. As she read, her dark eyes filled with tears. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began. "6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about success, about value, about what made someone worthy of respect. I was wrong about everything that mattered. You have taught me that true worth has nothing to do with money or status or the clothes we wear. It has everything to do with the kindness in our hearts, the compassion we show to others, and the courage to be better than we were yesterday. You saved Emma's life, but more than that, you saved mine. You took a man who had become cold and arrogant and cruel, and you showed him what it means to be truly good. I love you, Sarah Martinez, not despite our differences, but because you have made me understand that our differences are what make us stronger together than we ever could be apart. If you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the love and grace you have shown me." Sarah looked up from the letter with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Richard, I know it's complicated," he said quickly. "I know people will talk, and I know I hurt you terribly. But I also know that I have never loved anyone the way I love you, and I believe, I hope, that maybe you could love me too." Sarah set the letter down carefully on her coffee table, then reached up to touch Richard's face with gentle fingers. "I already do," she whispered. "God help me, I already do." When Richard kissed her, it was with all the tenderness and passion of a man who had finally found the person who made him want to be his best self. And when Sarah kissed him back, it was with all the love and forgiveness of a woman who had chosen to see the good in someone despite having every reason to focus on the bad. Their wedding 6 months later was a reflection of everything they had learned about what truly mattered. Instead of the elaborate society event that Richard's friends expected, they chose to marry in the hospital chapel, surrounded by the patients, families, and colleagues who had become their extended family. Emma served as the flower girl, beaming with joy as she scattered rose petals down the aisle. Dr. Morrison officiated, and the children from the pediatric ward, those who were well enough, served as an impromptu choir.
Sarah wore her grandmother's simple lace dress, altered to fit her perfectly, while Richard chose a classic suit that was elegant without being ostentatious. The reception was held in the hospital cafeteria, decorated with flowers from the hospital garden and filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of genuine joy that money couldn't buy. In his wedding speech, Richard spoke about the journey that had brought him to that moment. "I used to think that some people were born to lead and others were born to serve," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded cafeteria. "What I've learned is that the greatest leaders are those who serve with their whole hearts, and the most extraordinary people are often the ones we overlook because we're too busy looking for the wrong things. Sarah didn't just save my daughter's life that day in the emergency room, she saved my soul. She taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of our compassion, the strength of our character, and our willingness to see the divine spark in every person we meet." Sarah's response was characteristically gracious and humble. "Richard likes to say that I changed him," she said, smiling at her new husband, "but the truth is, we changed each other. Love does that. It takes two imperfect people and helps them become better together than they ever could have been apart. Our story didn't begin with a fairy tale meeting. It began with hurt and misunderstanding and pride. But it became a love story because we both chose to look past our first impressions, past our assumptions, past our fears, and see the person that God created the other to be." As they danced their first dance to an old song played by one of the maintenance workers who moonlighted as a guitarist, Richard held Sarah close and marveled at the journey that had brought them together. The woman in his arms had taught him that true love wasn't about finding someone who fit into your existing life. It was about being willing to build a new life together, one based on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that the best relationships are those that make both people better than they were before. Emma, now 8 years old and thriving in their blended family, watched her father and stepmother dance with the satisfied expression of someone who had always known they belonged together. She had gained not just a mother figure in Sarah, but also siblings in the form of Sarah's younger brother Miguel, who had moved to Chicago to attend college with Richard and Sarah's help, and the endless stream of young patients who considered Sarah their hospital mom. The changes at Mercy General in the months following Richard and Sarah's marriage were profound and lasting. Under Richard's reformed leadership and Sarah's influence, the hospital became known not just for its medical excellence, but for its compassionate care and innovative programs that served the entire community. Sarah completed her nurse practitioner degree and established a free clinic within the hospital that provided care for uninsured children and families. Richard used his business connections to fund scholarships for hospital employees who wanted to further their education, ensuring that talented people like Sarah would never be held back by financial constraints. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the hospital itself. The hierarchical, often cruel dynamic that had once existed between different levels of staff gave way to a collaborative environment where everyone's contributions were valued and recognized. Richard's public transformation from arrogant millionaire to compassionate leader became a powerful example of how people could change when they opened their hearts to growth and humility. Years later, when Richard would tell their story to friends or colleagues, he would always emphasize that the real miracle wasn't that a poor nurse had saved his daughter's life. It was that a proud, arrogant man had been saved by the love and grace of a woman who chose to see his potential rather than his failures. Sarah would always add that the miracle was mutual, that a woman who had been dismissed and humiliated had found the courage to trust again, and had discovered that sometimes our greatest challenges lead us to our greatest blessings.
Their love story became legend at Mercy General, told and retold by staff members who had witnessed the transformation of two people who had seemed completely incompatible. It served as a reminder that real love transcends social boundaries, that people can change if they're willing to do the hard work of examining their prejudices and growing beyond them, and that sometimes the most beautiful relationships come from the most unexpected beginnings. Emma, now in high school and planning to follow in Sarah's footsteps by studying nursing, often told her friends that her stepmother had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that everyone has a story worth knowing, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their position in life. It was a lesson that had changed not just her family, but an entire hospital, and continued to ripple outward into the community they served. And in the quiet moments, when Richard would find Sarah reading to a frightened child or comforting a worried parent, he would remember that morning when he had stood in the nursing station and declared that some people were born to serve and others to lead. He had been right about one thing: Sarah was born to serve. But what he hadn't understood then was that the greatest leaders are those who serve with their whole hearts, and that the most profound transformations happen not when we try to change others, but when we allow others to change us. Their story became more than just a hospital romance. It became a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, and the truth: real love has the power to transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they stood together in the same emergency room where Sarah had saved Emma's life, now watching their own newborn son sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms while Emma helped decorate the nurses' station for the hospital's annual appreciation dinner, Richard reflected on how completely his life had changed. The man who had once measured success by the balance in his bank account now measured it by the smiles on his patients' faces, the pride in his employees' eyes, and the love that surrounded him every single day.
Sarah looked up at him with those same dark eyes that had once filled with tears of humiliation, but now sparkled with joy and contentment. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "Just remembering," Richard replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Remembering how wrong I was about everything that mattered. And how right you are about everything that matters now," Sarah added, with a smile that still had the power to take his breath away. As the hospital bustled around them with the controlled chaos that had become the soundtrack of their love story, Richard Blackwell held his wife and son close and marveled at the beautiful life they had built together. It had started with cruelty and pride, but it had become something extraordinary through grace, forgiveness, and the kind of love that transforms not just two hearts, but everyone they touch. The nurse who had once been mocked for her simple clothes and humble background had become the heart of Mercy General Hospital, beloved by patients and staff alike. The millionaire who had once used his wealth as a weapon had learned to use it as a tool for healing and hope. And the little girl who had once wandered hospital halls alone now run through them with joy, surrounded by a family that had been born not from blood, but from the recognition that the most important connections we make in life are often the ones we never saw coming. Their story reminds us all that transformation is possible, that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead us to our most beautiful beginnings. It shows us that true worth isn't measured by what we have, but by who we are and how we treat others.
And most importantly, it proves that when we have the courage to look past our prejudices and open our hearts to growth, we might just find that the person we thought was beneath our notice is actually the one who will lift us higher than we ever dreamed possible. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of love and transformation, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to stay tuned for our next incredible story of human resilience and unexpected love. Until then, remember that every person you meet has a story worth knowing, and every interaction is an opportunity to choose kindness over judgment, compassion over cruelty, and love over fear.